America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. This is Episode 8, Article 5, George Mason's Answer to Tyranny. Hello again, and thank you for joining us for Episode 8 of the Liberty Brief Podcast. And once again, I'll be speaking with Dr. Thomas Giordano, author of the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. In the last episode, we talked about identifying the ills of our federal government and the methods we should use to clearly determine the original intent of the drafters, and just why and how the restrictions set up by the original construction of the Constitution were effectively bypassed. We talked about how we should prioritize the dysfunctions we diagnose, and we also agreed that the Constitution gives us the cure, and the cure was Article 5, Convention of the States. And we could use Article 5 to correct these tyrannical attempts at fundamentally changing our unique form of government. Did you know about the Convention of the States? Well, you're going to learn about that today, and we'll explain some of the history, constitutional requirements, and the amendment process itself for Article 5. So first, let's welcome Dr. Tom. Hello, Dr. Tom.
Hey, Rob. You don't want to welcome me in Italian?
I can just say benvenuto. What would the rest of that be?
You'd say benvenuto all'ottavo episodio del Liberty Brief Podcast. And
okay, that sounded pretty good.
Yeah, you should have known that, though.
I've got to work on my accent, though.
Okay. Well, come on over for a couple of weeks. We'll get you straight.
I'll be traveling soon. Okay, so let's jump right in here. In the last episode, we talked about a lot of things, and we were getting to the process of getting our federal government back on its intended course. And we talked about how to arrive at original intent with simple methods to pinpoint the source of the dysfunctions in government. Now we've identified the problem, and we need to start to talk about the solution. So today I'd like to talk with you about the Convention of States. Now, when I first read Article 5, I was really struck with the foresight our founders had. Now, they knew days like this were coming, and they gave us a process to control any form of corruption in government. So my first question, what can you tell us about Article 5, how it came about, and who was behind it?
Well, Rob, not all of our founders had the foresight you're giving them credit for. As you may recall, the Constitution was signed by the framers in Philadelphia on September 17, 1787, and was fully approved on June 21, 1788. The final document had some holes in it. I would say that the biggest was not clearly stating and guaranteeing what we now call the Bill of Rights. They took care of this oversight by incorporating the first 10 amendments by 1791. Another gaping hole was how to prevent another bloody revolt if the government ever became tyrannical. Now, this was recognized by George Mason during the drafting of the compact. You see, everybody assembled in Philly was very well aware of what happens when the people's voice is ignored by those in government. History has a boatload of examples, aside from the American and French revolutions, to illustrate.
Well, I know a little bit about George Mason, but not much. I know there was a university named after him, and that he was from the Commonwealth of Virginia. But that's about the extent of my knowledge.
It's a shame. It's a shame he didn't have a beer named after him. And then more.
Yes, then I would have studied him a lot in college.
Exactly. Maybe you and many more people would probably know who he was. You see, Rob, I'd say Mason is one of the most important undersung heroes of our founding. He was an interesting guy and a very complex thinker. I don't know if I'd call him a firebrand, but he certainly was a strong-willed character, and he also had a pretty tragic life.
What can you tell us about his life? Then maybe we can get to his contributions to the Constitution.
Well, Mason was born in what is now Fairfax County, Virginia, in 1725. His family was pretty well off, but his father died when George was 10, and his uncle John Mercer became his legal guardian. As a matter of fact, John Mercer became his mother's legal guardian as well. Mercer was an impressive fellow in his own right, and young George had the good fortune of going to live with an uncle who not only had an expansive library, but was also a neighbor and lawyer to George Washington. By his early 20s, Mason was already delving into Virginia politics. He entered into the House of Burgesses in 1759 as a representative of Fairfax County. He was married to a woman named Anne, and they had a slew of children, I think around 10. But his wife died in 1773 following the birth of a set of twins. Unfortunately, the twins passed away in infancy as well. So he took a very, very hard hit that particular year.
Well, those were rough days health-wise. There wasn't a lot of a lot of life expectancy. It was pretty low in the 18th century. I can only imagine what the infant mortality rate was.
Oh yeah, well, compared to today, it was extremely low, somewhere between 36 and 38 years of age. Of course, the Masons were a little more privileged than most, but still, we were living in an age of ignorance of many things that we take for granted in medicine today. Now, this was a little more than 100 years before the germ theory of disease, and even longer before the first antibiotics. Semmelweis and his observations on antiseptic fields in childbirth wouldn't be around until the middle of the following century, and his ideas wouldn't be confirmed by science until many years after that. You know, people just don't realize that if one of our American pioneers was out clearing a field and he cut himself, it was practically a sentence of death. In fact, the low life expectancy was what determined the ages to vote and hold office in the Constitution. The privilege to vote was set at 21 years because they figured a person had lived 2/3 of his life and was wise enough to vote by then.
You know, I find it hard to believe that on average Americans lived to about 36 or 38 years back then.
Well, many people are confused by the numbers. The actual reason that life expectancy was low is because it is an average based upon total births. Back then, infant and child mortality was about 46%, meaning that only 54% of live births lived past the age of 5 years. This would skew the total lifespan averages downward. It was not uncommon to see people live to a ripe old age. In the Masons' case, they had a total of 12 children. I'm not sure how many lived to adulthood, but the last 2 died soon after their mother passed away, probably from sepsis. This was the most common cause of postpartum maternal death. Usually it was from an E. coli infection that went septic. Life was no walk in the park for anyone back then. Even the general health of the people was subject to chronic illnesses and conditions with no known diagnoses at the time, nor cures. Mason himself was sick from the time he was a child and suffered from generally poor health all of his life.
Now, you say his wife Anne died in 1773. Did he participate in the war then?
Oh, yes, he did. Even in his 50s, and as sick as he was, Mason was a leader of the Virginia Patriots on the fields of battle against the Crown's forces. But even before this, he had an undeniable influence upon Thomas Jefferson with the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. It is not unlikely that between him and Dr. Filippo Mazzei, Jefferson incorporated the idea of unalienable rights into the document.
Well, I don't want to get too far afield, but you mentioned Mazzei. It sounds like a paisan.
Oh, yeah.
Who is he?
He was a paisano. We could dedicate an entire podcast episode to Filippo Mazzei. But he was an Italian physician from Tuscany. By sheer happenstance, he met Ben Franklin and John Adams in London in 1755. And the three of them became very good friends. He was surprised to find that Franklin could speak his language. He spoke Toscano. Now, back then, the Italian that was most commonly spoken was Tuscan Italian. Sometime in the early 1770s, the Grand Duke of Tuscany requested that Mazzei get in touch with Franklin to purchase a couple of his stoves. So, long story short, Franklin encouraged Mazzei to go to Virginia with some of his paesani and start cultivating grapes, olives, and figs. They also talked about growing silkworms.
Paesani is plural for paesano.
Yes. Paesano is singular. Paesani is plural.
So we had a bunch of paesanis.
Yeah.
Now, why would they want to grow grapes and olives and figs in Virginia?
Well, British tariffs. You see, when Mazzei first ran into Franklin and Adams in London, they were there in 1755 specifically to try to get the British off the Americans' back and get rid of the tariffs or reduce them in some way. You see, everything imported into the colonies had to go through English brokers who controlled the Atlantic trade routes. They tacked a fee onto every product going in or out of the colonies, supposedly because they were using British waters during transport.
So that sucks. You're saying that they wanted to bypass those trade routes and produce their own products on American soil.
Yes, yes. And here's the thing. Mazzei was not only a physician and a wine merchant. Franklin knew that Mazzei's family had been producing fine Tuscan wines since 1435. Aside from having a centuries-old tradition of producing wines, the family also grew olives for olive oil and raised silkworms to make fine silk, all of which are traditional to the Tuscan region of the Italian peninsula. It was an easy task for Dr. Mazzei to gather the plants, the bugs, and about a dozen Tuscan farmers to start an enterprise in Virginia. And that's exactly what he did.
All right, so that happened. What happened next? How did he influence Thomas Jefferson?
Well, arriving in Virginia in 1773, he was quickly introduced to Thomas Jefferson. He was further shocked to find that Jefferson also spoke Toscano fluently, and they started the first commercial vineyard in the American colonies. Jefferson was so taken by the intellectual capacity of Mazzei and how much they had in common in their political philosophies. They spent hours in the evening discussing, common interests. It was Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams who introduced Mazzei to George Washington and George Mason and many other prominent Virginians. When he got there, what they did was they had these formal dinners where they introduced him. Mason and Mazzei also became fast friends. In any case, Mazzei purchased about 400 acres of Jefferson's estate, Monticello, and set out to work. He also built a mansion on that 400 acres and called it Le Colle, which in Italian means the hills, but also became very, very heavily involved in Virginia politics and the pursuit of colonial independence. In 1774, Jefferson pushed Mazzei to publish his political views. And Mazzei was a little bit embarrassed and reluctant, to try to express his ideas in proper English. So Jefferson told him to write the article in Italian, and he would translate it into English for him. Mazzei chose a pseudonym, Furioso, and authored an essay which appeared in the Virginia Gazette.
So that was a couple of years before the Declaration.
Yes, it was, yes. Now, one of the lines in the article that Jefferson translated from Italian was, and I quote, "Tutti gli uomini sono per natura egualmente liberi e indipendenti. Questa eguaglianza è necessaria per costituire un governo libero. Bisogna che ognuno sia uguale all'altro nel diritto naturale." Unquote. Now, Jefferson translated this line into English thusly, quote, "All men are by nature equally free and independent. This equality is necessary in order to create a free government. All men must be equal to each other in natural rights, unquote. Now, I want you to listen to something else. In May of 1776, George Mason penned the Virginia Declaration of Rights. In Article 1, we read, quote, that all men are created equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights, of which they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, unquote. So from here, there should be absolutely no doubt that Mazzei and Mason influenced Jefferson's later drafting of the Declaration of Independence. The words come right from them, and it's documented.
Well, I never heard of Mazzei before. In fact, I had no idea that our founders were fluent in Italian. I thought Italians more or less disappeared after Columbus. I didn't even know there were any Italians in pre-revolutionary America. Anyway, this episode is dedicated to Article 5, so we'll have to get back on track with George Mason.
Yeah, well, right. Well, there was a swirl of ideas, activities, and movements sweeping up around the time of the American Revolution. We can dedicate a future episode to the few Italians that were here in the American colonies. But let's fast forward to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Mason went to Philadelphia as a Virginia delegate along with George Washington and James Madison. In spite of his poor health, he was immensely persuasive in the composition of the Constitution. Mason promoted strong local governments and a weak central government. This was primary to him.
He'd be really pissed about today. But that was the idea, right? I mean, didn't most of the drafters have similar ideas about the structure of the federal government?
Well, not really. Not really. Without going into too much detail in the conflicts between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, without going into too much of that detail, the document that came out of Independence Hall was, after all, a workable compromise. And Mason wasn't too happy about the outcome, and he made no bones about expressing his concerns. For one, he was disgusted at the provision allowing the internal slave trade to continue until 1808. He called it disgraceful to mankind, even though he had inherited many slaves himself. He also didn't think the South was treated too fairly with this compact. But the most important thing about Mason is that he passionately objected to the powers that were granted to the new government. He saw them as unclear, overzealous, and lacking in definition.
So he didn't sign the Constitution. What was it that he didn't sign besides what you've just told us? I mean, you'd have to have some pretty strong reasons not to want to get on board with the rest of the framers.
Well, he recognized the flaws that others seem to have been oblivious to. He was insistent that the rights of the individual citizen be recognized as foundational and stated so. He also saw no way for the people or the states to rein in a tyrannical government. Given the lack of clarity in the Constitution, he believed that it would be subject to corrupt individuals within it. He wanted no ambiguity as to the subservient role of the federal government at all levels. In fact, when he got back to Virginia, he actively campaigned against the ratification of the final draft of the U.S. Constitution. He refused to put his signature to it and declared, "I would sooner chop off my right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands." So, yeah, he was quite a character.
But, however, the Constitution was approved in September of 1787.
Right.
And I remember that it was by a pretty small margin.
Yes, it was. The vote was 89 in favor to 79 against. Okay. So
Mason, he wasn't alone in his concerns.
No, you're right. He was not. And he acted feverishly to correct the flaws that he saw in the document. He was no crank. He was not a crazy man. and many people understood his reasoning and supported his efforts. Remember, he was a sickly 62-year-old widower at the time. His efforts did eventually pay off with Article 5 and the ratification of the Bill of Rights in December of 1791. I think that George Mason probably went to his grave in peace, knowing that the Bill of Rights was added, less than a year later. I mean, he died in 1792.
All right, Dr. Tom. Well, that was a lot of color that we needed to put around this, and quite a bit of necessary history, because we can see that Article 5 was adopted specifically for the reasons we're considering it today.
Yes, that's true.
The framers gave us a legal way to avoid bloodshed or violent overthrow. So now let's get into Article 5. So let me read from my pocket constitution, Article 5. I happen to have my constitution here handy.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I need it when I
just don't take it with you when you go driving around. You might get stopped by the cops as being a subversive. They might arrest you for subversion.
Yeah, I'd be labeled a radical rightist. Well, here it is. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. Now, here's the money line, Tom. Or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. And then it goes on with several provisos, but then it states that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate.
Right.
So that's it. Right. Article 5 basically says that a convention can be called by the several states. And what is a convention? It's a meeting. It's nothing more than that. That's what a convention is.
That's exactly right. It comes from Latin, convenire. Today we have 50 states. So it takes 34 states to call the convention and 38 to ratify any amendments that are proposed. It was a bit easier back in the day because of the number of states, but the principle still stands. The states can push aside bad actors in government and amend the Constitution. My brother Eddie is active in New Jersey, but I'm here in Italy and I'm not able to, to play an active role or participate directly at ground level. Perhaps you can fill me in on what's going on. I know that there are already 19 states that are ready to go, and more are on the way.
Yes, well, Pennsylvania is one of them, and there are chapters throughout the state, usually by county or district. And there's one near Philadelphia here. It's in Plymouth Meeting that meets monthly, very active. And Pennsylvania is on the cusp of getting there too. So if anyone in our audience wants to get involved in a convention of states, you can look it up on the web, find out where the meeting is in your state, and join. And it doesn't take a lot of effort. You can just put as much effort as you can or as little as you can. Mostly it would help if you were talking with your state legislator, either by email or phone, and talking to other people as well. And I tried that myself. My state legislator, she is against the proceeding.
Let me guess.
To work on her a little bit.
Let me guess. She's a Democrat.
How did you know?
Oh, how do I know?
Well, you had a 50-50 shot.
Yeah, well, actually, it was
anyway,
75-25 shot. She could have been a rhino Republican.
Well, in any case, you can do that. You can join a Facebook group. There are Facebook groups that are a convention of states groups. They have lots of information on it. So I would encourage our audience that, this is the number one thing that you can do to get involved in reining in some tyranny.
Right.
And you don't have to feel helpless. You have a way to do this. And state by state, we're going to get there. So we're at 19 and we need 34, right, Tom?
Yeah. And, hopefully, I have no doubts that a convention will be held. Especially if we throw some Democrats out of Congress in the next election in 2022, and if we take the White House, either having Trump or Ron DeSantis run for the office, I have no doubt that they'll be elected. You see, the problem that we face is that there's going to be a lot of resistance, and I would suggest that even if it's just a question of putting your signature on a petition, do it. Doesn't cost you a thing. And it may very well save your country for your children and your grandchildren. The opposition, and I have no doubt, I have no compunction of calling it Marxist. The Marxist opposition has been at this for well over 100 years. They can call themselves whatever they want, progressives, social democrats, whatever they want to call themselves. But they've been eating away. They've been chipping away at our Constitution and chipping away at our rights for just about 100 years. Mark Levin makes the argument very, very clear in his writings. And, we have Mark Levin to thank for, basically bringing to the attention of the people Article 5. The Convention of the States. It is within our rights to change a government that is going tyrannical. We've already lost the Senate. The Senate has effectively been turned into an oligarchy, and we're rapidly losing the presidency, which is being turned into a tyranny.
So what are the kinds of things that the Convention of States are going to be proposing? If you were to Google Mark Levin's convention proposals, that has a lot of common sense things in there, like term limits.
Yes.
The repeal of the amendment. Is it the 14th Amendment or the 17th? I always
17th. 17th for
the 17th Amendment, which made the Senate electable instead of instead of having the state legislatures assign your senator.
Well, actually, they selected them. They were voted upon too.
Yes.
But you see, the assembly in your state was elected by the people, and the People's Assembly selected the senator to protect the interests of the state sovereignty. So that is
these guys wouldn't. I didn't mean to.
No. Go ahead.
So these senators wouldn't have to have big war chests with millions of dollars in dark money and donors,
right,
lining their pockets in order to get elected. And if they screw up, the state would recall them.
Absolutely,
that would be great.
Absolutely, that would be the best thing. But you see, the thing is, no one of the drafters back in 1787 would have agreed to have a person in the Senate for 50 and 60 years. That would have been, the very reason that they wanted a representative constitutional federal republic was specifically to protect the state sovereignty and the natural and personal rights of the people. That's being all taken away from us.
Well,
now the first thing that we should do is the structure. Get back to the original structure of the government. And that means put the selection of senators back in the hands of the assembly. And the other thing is to write a preemptive amendment that states that the election of the president and vice president in the executive branch shall be done by no other process but an electoral college, and that those electoral college votes, the delegates, are to be determined within the state and not have any influence from any other state. They start playing with that, and we're cooked. They've just turned our federal republic into a direct vote democracy. That's exactly what they did not want.
All right. So here's some of the things that Mark Levin's proposing: term limits for Supreme Court justices, requiring a balanced budget, repeal of the 17th Amendment. We just talked about it. limit eminent domain powers in case people are trying to take over property, allow states to more easily amend the Constitution by bypassing Congress, create a process where 2/3 of the states can nullify federal laws, and here's a good one, require photo ID to vote and limit early voting, just like they do in Mexico and other places.
Yeah, exactly. These are things that are already, part and parcel of our process.
So that and
so it's a shame that we have to reinforce all this stuff again.
These were things that were kind of known back in the day. I mean, we never really, we always, we don't even propose a budget anymore. It just laughed off of the congressional floor. But requiring a balanced budget would require these folks to really put their heads together and make something happen. Requiring a photo ID after the last election, who could contest that?
The Democrats would contest it. Who do you think contests it?
Yeah.
Look, the political rights of American citizens gives them the right to vote and the right to hold office as a citizen. No one in the rest of the world who is not a citizen of the United States is permitted to vote. No one in the rest of the world who is not a citizen of the United States is permitted to hold office. These are the basic definitions of political rights.
We've gone so far astray that it's time to rein this in. So get involved. That's the message for the day. And we'll make this happen.
Well, I'm hoping.
I'm confident of it too, Dr. Tom. Now, next week, I don't know if I'll be able to join you on the podcast. So do you have anything in mind that you're going to be speaking about?
I don't know. I'll probably come in with 3 or 4 of my South American buddies with, armed, and we'll take over the studio. And I don't know. I'm thinking seriously of doing what we spoke about in the last podcast, the tale of 3 bridges. The Tacony Palmyra, the Benjamin Franklin, and the Walt Whitman Bridge over the Delaware River, and how it is a perfect example of Dr. Milton Friedman's 4 ways of spending money. I think people will find it very interesting.
I'm familiar with those bridges, and I know you are too. You cross them many times.
Every day.
You have to tie that into the idea of unalienability.
Yes, well, think about it. You're paying taxes in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and you live out in Pittsburgh, and you're paying taxes for a bridge that's crossing the Delaware that you may never use. So simply because it's utilitarian, it doesn't mean that you should be paying for it. But it's pretty interesting. It's a pretty interesting concept, especially when you learn that the Tacony Palmyra and the Ben Franklin bridges were designed by the same architect. So anyway, but I'll tell you the stories. I'll put that together. I did write an article on it some while back, I think a few years ago, and I still have it in my mind. So if I could find the article, I could easily turn it into a podcast, and I think I'll do that.
All right. So our audience can look forward to that. In the meantime, I think we're going to close this down, and we will see you next time. Thank you, Dr. Tom.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.